Hello, and welcome to episode 149 of the Elevate Your Running podcast. My name is Sarah Manderscheid. I am your host, your speaker, your podcaster for today. I'm excited for this episode. This is one that has been a few weeks in the making. About a month ago, I reached out to my Instagram followers asking them for their training and racing questions. And I got some good questions, and I am pretty sure, I really hope I'm able to answer all of these before some of these runners are racing their a goal fall race. But I know we're in for a treat. I think anytime that someone has a question about anything in life, whether it's running or it can be anything, that there's probably more people thinking it. So kudos to everyone who reached out, asking some really good thoughtful questions, and we're spanning every area of running and training and racing today. So to kick it off, we are going to start off with the training section. Now, this question is a question that Jenna and I talked briefly on in our episode last week, which was the Indianapolis Marathon recap episode. And that was a really fun episode to record. We had a lot of fun training. We had a great weekend together in Indianapolis. The race itself ended up being like a pretty B kind of day for me, and not really the day that Jenna had in mind. And that is the marathon. If I learned anything over the last week, it's that the marathon is tough. The marathon is hard. And that's not something that I've recently learned. It's something that I've always known, but I think it's something that we forget. And then maybe it makes us go back to that distance, but gosh, it's hard. And you really have to be ready to tackle those late miles and be ready to go into a place that you probably don't go in training because you're racing, and that's a totally different place to be when you're kind of in the pain cave racing, and specifically with a marathon, because you never know when that place is going to start, when it's going to, if you're going to flow out of it, if you're just going to hang on to it throughout the race. So it's all a very interesting, it's an interesting distance for sure. And it's a very rewarding experience. I'm a big believer that the training, I mean, I love the training. The training is the reward for me. And to be able to go through my seventh marathon training cycle, just feeling really grateful, got through it healthy, got through it with a lot of fun, had a lot of joy. I have some really great people in my life supporting me through that prep, which also I think helped quite a bit. So for this training question, an Instagram follower asked, how was your fueling leading up to and during the race? And can you talk about carb loading? So we did talk about this briefly last week. We talked about how we didn't really track our macros. We didn't really track what we were eating day to day, but kind of like the idea around eat as much as you can, right? I think for me, there's always going to be there's one day out of the week. It's Wednesday. That's it's just a very busy day. I can plan as much as I can ahead, and I always seem to never have enough food with me. And it's a day where I'm literally on the go for 15 hours. And it's also one of my biggest training days. So the recovery gets to happen in a slightly different way. And I do the best that I can do with it that day, but I hit it really hard the days kind of bookending that day. So very intuitive, very eat as much as I can, which isn't very scientific, right? That's just like how I feel. And I know a lot of runners can get through, especially in the summer, or if you're going through a big prep, your hunger cues are skewed, right? So you might not be fueling enough. I would actually say most runners are actually under fueling because we just use so much energy for training. It's really hard to be able to fuel ourselves in the best way possible, but you can do that. So making sure that you're taking in more nutrients on your workout in your long run days is very important. For someone like me, maybe you fall in this category where one day of the week that happens to fall on your workout day is also very busy and it's hard to be able to eat enough. I like to really focus on my Tuesday and Thursday and making sure that that's those 2 days are great or as great as they can be. but definitely doing what you can do to make sure that you are fueling well before, during, and right after those hard sessions, those long workouts, those long runs. That's going to be really important. And then carbo loading. Carbo loading is essentially like loading your body full of glycogen the days leading up to the race. And historically, I've always followed a 3-day carbo load. It's something that I do recommend to all the athletes that I coach, 3 days. We target 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrates per body pound. I don't go by kilos. I think it's just easier because we generally know like how many pounds we weigh versus kilos, but you can convert it if you want to. And we practice it. We practice it in training. It's one of the things that I really like to do with all my marathoners is making sure that they get to practice it a day before one of their bigger long runs. For me specifically, I would always focus on a heavier carbohydrate dinner the night before my long run. I think that's always important. It always makes me feel a little bit better getting up on a Saturday morning, getting ready to run, X number of miles. But when you're specifically carb loading for a marathon, it's anywhere from 2 to 3 days. So new research and new science has shown that you can reduce that down to 2 days. I'm focusing on making sure that you're taking a ratio of glucose to fructose. And fructose is very important to also make sure that you're consuming each day, especially on race morning, because it is going to be one of the factors that leads to feeling or hopefully being able to fuel your body and run the best that you can that day. Glucose is essentially the energy in our muscles that we need to have to be able to produce a strong race. So if you can carb load with 3 to 5 grams of simple carbohydrates 2 to 3 days leading up to the race, think of it like a gas tank, like you are on full going into that race. You want to get a good breakfast in. That could be anywhere. I mean, I typically fall between 180 to 100 grams of carbohydrates before that first or before my race. But I know some people have gone well over that. It is something that you need to practice. It is something that you need to make sure that your gut is able to handle. If you take in too many carbs, if you take in too many things over this carb load process, it can cause GI distress. And this is one of the reasons why we practice it on the Elevate team during their training to see what works, what doesn't work, and then just do that. Like, don't change anything. And I know with travel races, that can be extremely difficult because you're traveling. You might not have access to the things that you normally eat. I know for last weekend in Indianapolis, it wasn't exactly what I was hoping for in terms of food. Both nights for dinner wasn't exactly what I was wanting or needing. And it was just really difficult to find what we were looking for and making sure that we had enough. But we made do. It was fine. It just wasn't, sometimes when you go through this process and everything is kind of the same, every Friday night dinner is the same, every Saturday morning breakfast before your long run's the same. I think it's really important to keep that tradition alive on race weekend because it builds confidence, right? If you know your Friday night dinner and your Saturday morning breakfast work for you, that builds confidence going into race day. So you know that like everything is the same and you're not throwing something out into the universe that could cause something to happen. It is within your control. And that is one of those things that, although we don't want to control everything, we do want to have kind of a say in how that looks and what that looks like, because it is a really important part to racing. The carb load, 2 to 3 days, 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrates per body pound, simple carbohydrates. I focused more on liquid carbohydrates during this last carb session before Indy. I really liked that. I felt like that just overall felt better, that I wasn't just like stuffing my face full of bread, even though that definitely happened. So that was kind of a nice change. I used the Morton 360 drink that has 80 grams of carbohydrates in it. And then I also was drinking orange juice, which has in a 12-ounce serving has 36 grams of carbohydrates. Plus it also contains fructose, which is a huge piece to the carbo load. If you're looking for more information specifically on the carb loading process, check out the Strength Running podcast from it was a few weeks ago. There was a sports scientist named Jonah Rosner that was on the podcast, and he spoke all about this. It was a really fascinating episode. It was perfect timing for November, December marathons, and that was released on Halloween on October 3rd. And the title is The New Rules of Carb Loading with sports scientist Jonah Rosner. I think it was a great episode. I listened to it twice. And I learned new things and I applied it to this carbo load, and I don't think it hurt me in any way. All right, let's get into racing. So for racing, how do you pace a Hilly race? I'm racing the Seattle Marathon in 5 weeks, which is probably now 2 weeks, with 1,600 feet of gain. Oh my goodness. Well, one, congratulations. I mean, Seattle is a beautiful city. It's a beautiful town. I'm sure the marathon is gorgeous. The hilliest race I've run is the Boston Marathon with 800 to 850 feet of gain. But it's like downhill, net downhill. So that's a little bit different than 1,600 feet of gain in the Seattle Marathon. And I'm not exactly sure where these hills are placed. I'm assuming with 1,600 feet of gain, it's throughout the entire 26 miles. And there's probably a few steep hills in there for sure. So I think first and foremost, you have to have patience going into a hilly race like this. With 1,600 feet of gain, you could almost look at it like a trail race because it is pretty significant. Your training gets to resemble the course for sure. Hopefully, in your training, you had a lot of long hill repeats, you had a lot of hilly long runs, and you also practiced running on effort because effort is going to reign. And what I learned about Indianapolis too is like we kind of mentioned this, Jenna and I kind of mentioned this on the podcast, but like Nell was like, run 7 for the half and like just run what feels good, like what you can do, right? And that really is the marathon. Like we can sit here and analyze all these different splits and all this data, but really when it comes to it, it has to feel a certain way and you can't force a pace at all, especially a hilly marathon and a hilly race. So pacing and running on effort is going to be huge, but also pacing yourself and making sure that you're getting up each hill and down each hill for what it is. And you're not trying to race right out of the gate, especially over the course of just such a long duration. So I think really pacing up the hill and then using that downhill to recover is going to be key. I really like running uphill a little bit slower. You want to have good control. You want to have good running form. You want to have that engaged core, that slight forward lean. You want to have that arm pumping, which I think like it can either be cheek to cheek where your hand is flowing like from face cheek to glute cheek, or you're thinking about pulling yourself up the hill by pulling on a rope. And that will provide a really nice arm swing, which is going to provide a really nice cadence up that hill. Now, once you come down the hill, letting yourself recover. So that's not going to be immediate. Especially the longer you go through the race, it's going to take longer to recover from the hills. So like on the downhill, giving yourself grace, letting that gravity take you down, not taking the hill too fast on the down, because what we know to be true about fast downhill running is that it is going to eat up your quads. And if that happens in the first half of the race, it's going to make for a very, very tough second half. So you really want to be patient. You really want to pace yourself well. You want to pace on each individual hill. And I think it's also very important to pace on effort, especially I don't know if this person has a time goal. I don't know if it's their first one or if they've been maybe on trails and now they're transitioning to a hilly road marathon. My guess is that they haven't, just asking about how to pace a hilly race. But I think it's also important to chunk up the race and make it in a way that's going to be digestible for you. Now, this is a tip that applies to every single race. It was something I probably could have done better on in my last build, is like thinking about how I was going to chunk up the race and then to do that in a long run. Something that came to mind, it was something that I coached Carter through. Now, Carter also ran the Indianapolis Marathon, and we didn't get to talk about this last week, but Carter absolutely crushed this race. She ran a 3:03, 18-minute PR. She passed me at mile 20. She said something with my name in it. I don't even know. I was in such a daze. And I just like looked at her and I'm like, who is that? That's Carter. And she just looked so strong, and she cruised a huge negative split race, which was exactly what I was hoping and knowing she could do. Now, we chunked up that race for her into 4 by 5 miles, with each 5 mile chunk getting a little bit faster. And then when she got to the 20 mile mark, I wanted her to really kick it in and just start to like push the pace. And that's exactly what she did. And so you could take a look at the Seattle Marathon or whatever marathon that you're running, if this applies to other people, and chunk it up in a way that makes sense for you. I know that some athletes running Chicago chunked up that race based on where their like friends and families were standing. And that was going to be how they chunked up the race. I was kind of chunking my Indianapolis. I wanted to do 4 by 5 miles. It was something I'd practiced, I guess, in training, but it wasn't something that I was thinking about on how I was going to race, if that makes sense, while I was running it. So I was just kind of taking it like, let's just get through the half and see what happens. But everyone gets to be different with this. If you're looking for more information on how to chunk up a race, that's going to be episode 139 with sports psychology coach Emily Saul. And she talks all about how to chunk up the marathon. And it was an incredible episode. It's one of our best performing episodes. And with it being just a newly released episode, that says a lot, because a lot of you are binge listening to the Elevate episodes right now, which I love. But that one has done extremely well. So definitely listen to it if you haven't already. And then I think it's really important to make sure that you think about and you visualize like how you want to run a hill or take a hill, right? And you can use those hills as metaphors of how you take a hill in training, or on race day is kind of how you take a hill in life. So like, let's take that approach of running strong, smooth, consistent. And you can just start talking to yourself every time you take a hill or run a hill, whether that's in a workout, a training run, maybe you're visualizing, how do you want to look? How do you want to feel? And really practicing that. I think that's going to be the key to your success. And I hope whoever submitted this question, I know we went back and forth on Instagram a little bit a few weeks ago, but since Indianapolis, my DMs it was overwhelmingly beautiful to get back to everyone. There were hundreds of messages, and that's not an exaggeration. And it was just a lovely time. But that also means that anyone that had DM'd me before that, there's no way I'm going to be able to find that again. So good luck to the Seattle Marathon runner who's running that race here shortly. I'm sure it's in a week or two. Let's transition over to recovery. What do you do for the week after running a half marathon? That's a really great question, because the half marathon distance is arguably the best distance to race. I love that distance so much. And one of the things that I love about it so much is that when you race a half marathon, it doesn't destroy your body like the marathon. And you recover faster from it. You can get back to running faster from it. If it is a tune-up half marathon, depending on the athlete, you can start running again the next day. That's something I did in my CIM build when I ran the Indianapolis half last year. I didn't stop running, but I had to take those runs following that race slow and controlled to make sure I didn't injure myself. But I think if you're going into, let's say it's an A goal half marathon, I think it's really important to take some days off, especially if you really run your potential. You are still going to have muscle soreness, fatigue, and that is something that, yes, you can run through, but also like, what's the upside to that? You can take a few days off and then just sprinkle in some easy runs and making sure that you're not overdoing it those next few weeks after the half marathon. Let's say you're new to the distance. When I saw this question, I immediately thought of this half marathon that my sister and I ran in 2027 and again in 2017 and 2018. It was a Seawees half marathon, and it was in Vancouver, Canada. It's it was put on, it was organized by Lululemon, and they no longer have this half marathon, which is like such a shame because it was so much fun. It was so much joy. It is like everything that Lululemon is. Like they just have like yoga events and like really fun expos and a big concert after the race and like really fun uplifting positive cheer squads on the course. You're running through the city of Vancouver, which is like my one of my top 3 cities ever. Like it's awesome. It's such a great city. Shout out to Dina if she's listening. And in 2018, we ran this race in the rain. Now, this was kind of in this era of my running where, and certainly for my sister, she fell in this category too. We were running 3 days a week. We were taking a few cycle classes at Cycle Bar or Soul Cycle. We were going on walks. We were hiking, but that was kind of the extent. Our longest long run was like 10 miles. I think all of us who have run half marathons can shake our heads and say, yes, I trained like that for at least one cycle. Well, I trained like that for at least a good 3 cycles, my first, second, and third half marathon. And I remember we finished that half marathon in 2018. It was raining. We both ran PRs. And we literally were sitting in the hotel room, or we were sitting in the hotel lobby, and we were having food from like the hotel restaurant because we were so sore and so tired and so fatigued and we couldn't move. And I was actually talking to my sister this morning about the Indianapolis Marathon, and we had a good laugh because she was asking about like, well, how does your body feel and all this stuff. And I was describing it to her and she's like, oh, wow, I haven't felt like that since the Seaweeds half marathon in 2018. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, we have felt this way from a half marathon. So you might feel really, really sore after a half marathon. So, like, take the time off, like, take the whole week off. Take time for you, like, take time for very light stretching a few days post half marathon. Take time for yoga. Really make sure that you're getting your sleep because sleep is the number one recovery tool out of everything you can do. Sleep is going to be the best thing for your body. And then, of course, giving it the nutrients and the fuel that it needs to be able to recover as quickly as possible. I would say all easy running for a few weeks if you have been a half marathoner who's been also running workouts. And maybe you could start to add in some light strides or something like that the second or third week after the half marathon. But I think it's also important to think about, like, well, what's next? And that could mean nothing, which is absolutely fine. But if you do have another race lined up, you could think about, like, well, what do I need to do to train for that race and kind of work backwards on how you structure your post race week in weeks to follow. But I know less is definitely more. I know it's really tough not to run, especially after a race, especially if you have a good race or maybe a not so good race. You want to be out there, and that is really normal. But I think it's really, really, really good to take time away and to be able to take that recovery so you don't get injured, you don't have the niggles, you really have time to just like be you and spend a little bit more time on hobbies or other things, which could involve sleep. So I hope that helps on how to recover, what you could do the week after a half marathon. The next question is 60 minutes too long to wait to have your post workout meal when trying to recover? So I wouldn't say no, but I also wouldn't say yes. I would say the faster you can get nutrients in after a workout, a long run, a race, the better, 1,000%. Something I was doing for Indianapolis prep was bringing Core Power protein shakes with me to my workouts and long runs in like a little cooler bag. And I would have those immediately following, like immediately. As soon as I got to my car, I would like slam this thing to try and start the recovery process and get the protein in and just start that. And I did that in Indianapolis when I got back to the hotel room. I like was texting Nell and was drinking my Core Power protein. And I think it's really important that the sooner you can get nutrients in your body, the better. They say like 30 to 45 minutes. The person that submitted this question worded it meal, and it's not always about a meal. Like you could think about like getting in 2 quick snacks that have like protein and carbohydrates. So usually I have like a banana, a boba bar, and a core power shake. Before I'm either going straight into my strength or for the long run, it's like getting back home. Well, we were doing strength after the long run too. So like going to strength and then coming home and having like a bigger meal. Episode 87, back in the archives, is how to fuel your way through training and racing with Megan Featherston, which was an incredible episode to record with her. And that also includes Austin, who was part of the podcast for the first year and a half of its existence. But I think it's also important to take a look at your running and training volume because, if you're going out for a 3-mile run, that's amazing. That's great. And like, you don't necessarily have to eat something right after that run, like, or waiting to eat, an hour after is fine. I think it's when we start getting into marathon training, we get into like heavier training cycles where the demand is so much greater, or maybe it's a speed season where the intensity is really high. We are going to want to have that recovery process starting ASAP. And this is one of the best ways to do it. Bring snacks with you, start that process then, and then you can maybe take a shower and then start thinking about making dinner versus rushing through that process. So earlier is always better. If 60 minutes is the best you can do, it's not going to be the end of the world, but sooner is better than later for sure. Okay, this question is all about, let's see, a coaching change. And then we'll get back into some training stuff. So, how do you navigate switching coaches? What to ask a potential coach? This is such a great question because if you are working with a coach, I think it can be, in most cases, really difficult to switch because there is a relationship and it's humans, and there's probably a reason why you started working with that coach, right? There's probably some really good positives. And if you're thinking about switching, then there's probably some things that are making you unhappy in that situation. And I think if you are working with a coach and you're looking to change, I think one, there is a potential of asking for what you need with that coach. And that was something I did a lot with the coach that I had in between when I was working with Nell, and really asking for what I needed, what I was looking for. And if you're direct and honest and saying, this is what I need, this is what I'm looking for, this is, I think, gonna like just help me feel like I'm either getting what I want or I'm making progress or whatever it is for you. Hopefully that coach hears you and sees you. And if it goes unnoticed, or if it's all lip surface, right? And it's not necessarily like you're not actually seeing it follow through, I think, yeah, absolutely. Like, start looking for a different coach that could be a better fit for you. I think it's also important to have a conversation with your current coach before you leave. Probably because I am a coach, and this is part of the coaching process. It's not my favorite part of the coaching process when athletes leave. It's especially for athletes that, you have a strong relationship with, it can be just a really bittersweet moment because whether they're switching coaches or they're stopping coaching, which is typically what kind of comes into my sphere, my universe, you want them to have the tools to set them up for success, to be able to do things on their own if that's what they're doing. But if you are looking to leave a coach, having that conversation with them. And something I ask all my athletes who leave is their feedback of, what worked, what didn't work. I really want to have your feedback. If there's something that upset you, if there's something that didn't sit right, if there was something that you needed, like, knowing that is like, that's so cool for a coach to like be open to that feedback, but then also hear that. And then they can apply it, because if one person's thinking it, there's probably others. And it could just be a blind spot, right? So I think it's important to have that conversation with your current coach. And then, coaches do understand it is part of the business. Like I just said, it's not like my favorite part of the business, but it does happen. It is part of it. And it's part of what we do. And, I think most coaches are still going to cheer you on regardless. Like we just want, at least for me, like the reason I got into this was to see runners excel at running, like do something that they love and elevate that. And when you get that and you run those PRs and you feel strong and you're building community, that's just such a fun piece. And it's going to just stick with you in life. And it's going to be one of those memories that you look back on and think that was a really cool thing that I did at that time in my life. Right. So we'll cheer you on regardless. And I think, of course, yeah, giving feedback, although scary, helps us coaches become better too, which is a win-win for everyone. But I think things on like what to ask a potential coach is, if you can connect with a coach and you think like, wow, their energy or their vibe is great, I think it's really important to ask them about their training philosophy, how they train specifically for an athlete like you. If you are a Boston qualifying athlete and you want to run the Boston Marathon, ask them like, what are some things that we would do in training that aligns with this race, and how would we set that up? I think it's also really important, this is something that not many people talk about, is asking the coach about their coaching values. And this was something I learned in Dr. Laura Pence's Coaches Collective this summer. And we went through our values as a coach and like why we do this and why we love it. And the values speak volumes. So the values could be strong communication, it could be growth, it could be excellence, it could be competition. And just with those four values, those are four very different coaches. If you have a coach that is a coach who really values competition, being very serious, that is very different from a coach who could be more focused on the process or the growth of an athlete, or a coach who really values communication could be a lot different than a coach who doesn't necessarily value communication, right? And a lot of coaching is communicating and talking with athletes, and not just about training, but I'm a big believer that it's also about the human side of it too. So their values are really important. I think the type of athlete that they specialize in coaching is really important. Yes, run coaches can coach every type of athlete, not every type of athlete, but I think we are able to coach a lot of different distances, a lot of different athletes, but we all kind of specialize in one or two types of athletes, right? And that's going to be kind of, I think, the secret, like that's the secret sauce. Like you want kind of that coach that specializes in that athlete that maybe resembles you, because you'll know that that's kind of their niche and that's their area of expertise and that's where they specialize, and you're probably going to get the most out of it in that way. And then I think what's also really good to ask is their communication style and their expectations for you. Because I had someone ask me this very, very early on when I started coaching, and I thought, that is a great question. Like, they're asking me how they need to show up to get the best out of the situation. Because in the relationship, because that's really what it is. It's a relationship, and being able to have the right communication style for the two parties is crucial, and also making sure that the expectations are set with consistency and communication, and just making sure that both parties are on the same page is crucial. If you're looking for more information on navigating coaches and switching coaches, episode 63, also an archived episode. This was a solo episode that I recorded a long time ago, but it was 5 things to think about when hiring a running coach. And those are just things to think about before you make a decision, because it is a really important decision. I'm a big believer that like not everyone is for everyone. So you finding the right fit is really a big piece to the process. And that's going to be a big aspect to it. Good luck. All right. So getting back into training, we're going to go into, do you preload electrolytes in the 1 to 2 days before the marathon? Yes, I typically do. Most, like, just generally I do, living at altitude, living at higher elevation. I definitely take a lot of element in the summer. I'm taking 2 elements a day because I just sweat a lot and I lose a lot. And that was very true in Indianapolis as well, that the humidity was high and I was soaked through my kit very early on in the race. And that's not going to be my A-day race because I'm just losing more than I can take in at that point. It's really just trying to limit the damage as best as I can. Our saving grace for Indianapolis was that it stayed cloudy until about the last okay for me. And I think Jenna had quite a bit more sun than I did in the last 20-ish minutes of her race. So, not great. But yeah, I mean, I definitely preload electrolytes. I think it's important to always stay hydrated, right? That's like essential for being a runner because we do sweat when we run, even if we don't feel like we do. But you also don't want to overhydrate because then you're also going to lose electrolytes. So you want to make sure that your hydration, ideally it's around 100 ounces a day. But if you're like, ooh, I'm running a race in a week and I'm taking in about 70, great. Maybe bump it up to 75, 76 ounces, maybe up to 80, but like just stop there and just take in electrolytes and do the best that you can do, because if you overhydrate, you're going to lose all of that, all of those extra electrolytes. And that's exactly what you don't want to do going into, especially a marathon distance. I think it's easier to get away with it in the 5K, 10K and half, which is why I really like those distances. And, not knocking the marathon at all. It's just a really tough distance to get through. Staying hydrated, at least for me. And then I definitely use double electrolytes during the summer, warm training sessions. That's going to be key. I think it's also important, excuse me. I think it's also really important to make sure that you understand how much you're losing and taking a sweat test. And you can find out more information on that on Megan Featherston's website. And she also has a bunch of other like calculators and tools on how to figure out like how much sweat you're losing, how to replace it, how much to replace, all those good things, because everyone is so different when it comes to this. And like I run with girls on long runs, and even like in Indianapolis, like people are running without handhelds, they're not taking in water. And I mean, the joke of the season was like how much water I consume on summer long runs. It's ridiculous. I take in like 60 to 70 ounces during a long run, and I'm just drinking all the time, and I just need it. Or at least I feel like I need it, but it is something that's going to be specialized and different for everyone. And then let's see, our last question is how to stop mentally choking during races and perform to my potential. So this is a really big question because is it happening in the marathon? Is it happening in other distances? The marathon itself is just so mental. So it'd be interesting to know kind of what distance this is happening in, but maybe it's happening in all the distances. All right. So I'm going to first ask, what's causing the performance anxiety? So when you name that, the second question is, what is scary about that? Journal about it, think about it. I think it's really important to have that belief and confidence when you head into a race, right? You're stronger than you think you are. You can do hard things. I think creating mantras are always great, using them in training, but you have to also believe it. You have to believe in the mantras. You have to use them in training. You have to train your brain in training before you get to the race, because if you think you're going to use all these new things on race day, it's not going to work. I did a lot of visualization and a lot of training during training for my mind, and it still just wasn't quite there for race day. Like it was until it wasn't. And then I never really got back online. It was just kind of interesting, still kind of trying to process that. But I think the biggest takeaway, your performance anxiety that's coming up is maybe how can you distract yourself from your mind, right? Because that's really what it is. And I don't like distraction because it's almost like you're avoiding like the problem or the issue, but it does actually help in this case. So you could push yourself through from what your mind is already telling you. So if you distract, let's say your mind is chattering something and it's causing this anxiety, it's causing you to slow down or stop or walk, or you're telling yourself you can't do it. Distracting yourself from those thoughts and focusing in on the inner pieces, right? This is going to be more of the internal, the close to you kind of pieces. Dr. Ross, who's also a sports psychologist, talks a lot about this with the Elevate athletes, and it's really taking it in close to you. So what does that mean? It's focusing on your running form. It's focusing on your breath. It's focusing on your steps that you're taking, the music that you might be playing, staying with the person that's ahead of you or next to you. And another thing that can be really powerful is talking to yourself like you are your own coach. Or if you have a coach, hearing their voice and like what they would tell you in that moment, or maybe if you've heard them cheer you on or tell you that you can do it, or these like motivating things at practice, kind of channeling that anytime that anxiety starts to creep in or rise, or maybe it's full on just show up, right? It just shows up very, very quickly. But I think it's also important to train your brain to overcome all that mental garbage that's happening, right? And that's going to come through the visualization. Now, there can be productive visualization. I talked about this last week. I don't think I did enough visualizing on the right things that I needed to. I really focused in on so much positivity that I wasn't totally prepared of like, oh, when my legs feel hard at mile 16, how am I going to show up? I just felt like, oh, when my legs start to feel tired and this starts to feel hard at 22, how am I going to show up? Which is very, very different. So, how you can train your brain and visualize is think about your race, your performance, how you're going to show up, your mantras on your training runs. Focus on it during hard efforts. So, this could be on your workouts or your long runs. And this doesn't have to be throughout the whole duration of the run or long run. It can be for a very small amount of time. On the track this summer, in fall, there were moments where like I felt good, I felt strong. And then there would be like maybe one part to one rep that I was like, whoosh, I really got to get through this. And I would usually break it down by distance and then think about like maybe someone who has talked about that distance, or think about it in like chunking it down by like getting through the 100 and then the next 100 and like sticking with my teammate. Like I would just kind of like break it down and get through it. And that really helped me. But it has to be part of your daily routine for this to be believable. It just has to be, because if you show up on race day or if you do it a few times, it's not going to be the first thing that you go to. And quite honestly, it wasn't the first thing that I went to at Indy. And I visualized the heck out of this race. I mean, it was on my mind on every single run. But again, it was kind of like on the wrong thing. So you got to really make sure that it's in that place of like, when things start to feel hard, let's start to play the scenario of it. Let's say it's the marathon. It's hard out of the gate. It's hard at the 10K. It's hard at the 10 mile. It's hard at the half. Like really start to pre-plan, if it starts to happen early, how can you show up? What can you do? How can you take your mind or your thoughts away from what your mind's telling you and focus it more inner on you? And you have to understand that racing is going to be hard. All of it. The 400 meters, the mile, the 5K, the half, the marathon, it's all going to be hard at some point. And I think we don't I don't know, at least my algorithm, like who I'm listening to on podcasts and YouTube and on social media and reading books about running and training, we don't necessarily talk about how hard it's going to be. And that is something that we have to accept when we sign up for a race. that if we are really, truly racing it, it will get hard. And we have to be able to be okay with that and to practice following through on how we get through that. So I think acceptance of the sport, that running is hard, racing is hard. You're tired when you're racing. Everyone else around you is also tired. And accepting it is kind of a big piece to it too, because if you can say, like, I'm tired, they're tired, the chatter might also start to lessen because you're accepting it, you're noticing it's everywhere, and you're able to kind of go inward and practice your visualization, maybe focus on your breath, your steps, your running form, all those good pieces that really do make for a strong runner. And if you kind of go into that space, generally you start to run a little bit faster because you're taking a look at the mechanics and how you're moving and what's working, what's not working. So I know Running Explained had a really great episode on race anxiety and how to to perform to your potential. And that was right before she took her hiatus earlier this fall. So that'll be an easy one to find on your podcast listening platform. But I also think it's really important to know, like, you're not alone. A lot of people, I think we all kind of have anxiety going into a race, but you just want to make sure that it's balanced enough where it's not limiting your potential or that it's not stopping you from what you're capable of doing. And I think the other thing that maybe we don't talk about enough either is like just racing more and racing more to get better at racing and getting better at practicing all the things that I just mentioned. Because yes, you can also practice it in training, which you get and need to do. But the more you race, the more you're going to be able to flow through it. You're going to be able to work through it. You're going to start to prove yourself right. That confidence is going to build. You're going to start to have that belief, and then you're going to be able to flow through it a little bit better. I know I get to work on the mindset of the last 10K of the marathon. So I get to race quite a bit in 2025, which is not really exciting for me. So it is going to be this like balancing act of making sure I'm still finding a lot of joy in running and training because I don't love to race. I've been pretty open about that. Like, I love to train. Training is the award for me, and the reward, it's really just so great. And of course, if I have a great race, like, that also feels good. But like the races that are just like not an A, I'm like, why do I do this? This is so hard, right? But it is also, like I mentioned, and advice I gave you, it is acceptance of the sport. This is what we do. It's what we sign up for. It cannot be all sunshine and rainbows because that is not life. That is not running. That is not anything. That is like reality. But we can do a lot to show up a little bit stronger each and every training cycle, each and every race, each and every day. And over time, that's going to grow. And you're just going to be a totally different runner when, in a year or 5 years, or when you look back on all this and, maybe your running career is kind of like not as on the forefront as it is now. And that's pretty cool to see. I know I've seen significant gains and um, over like the 5 years that I've been training, and with, a year and a half of like COVID and no races kind of in there. And it's a lot of fun to look back and think about how far I've come and how consistent I've been and how consistent I continue to be in racing, and kind of that ebb and flow that is very, very true with racing, of not every race is going to be a great race or a PR, but there definitely are still those races that you do get that benefit from, and you do get to learn a lot about yourself. You do get to focus on your process and your performance standards when you race. And that can also be a really cool piece to all of this. So this episode was a really fun one. I love the Q&As. I would absolutely love to do a live Q&A. I think that would be really fun. Let's figure out how to do that. It'd be a lot of fun to like actually see you and ask more questions and have this be a bit more interactive, but I really appreciate you. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you have a great week.